Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third webinar of a webinar series on long-term strategies under the Paris Agreement. This webinar series is co-organized by 2050 Pathways Platform, UN Development Program, and World Resources Institute. I'm Ichiro Sato at WRI. I will navigate today's webinar, which focuses on modeling and data analysis in developing long-term strategies. Here is the agenda. Today, I'm joined by distinguished speakers, and they will walk us through some important aspects of modeling and model-based data analysis. First, we will hear from Richard Baron, Executive Director of the 2050 Pathways Platform, who will give us a brief introduction to long-term strategies. Then we have Jay Edmonds with us. Jay is a chief scientist at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory of the United States. He is also a professor of University of Maryland. He will present some essential basics of modeling and model-based analysis. The third speaker is Marcela Jaramillo-Gil. Marcela is a climate policy expert at Inter-American Development Bank, IDB. She will speak about capacity development for modeling and data analysis based on IDB's first-hand experience in Latin America and Caribbean countries. After that, I will briefly introduce a way of using models to address the challenge of uncertainties. Presentations will be followed by a questions and answer session where participants can submit questions to the panelists. During this webinar, participants will remain in listen-only mode. Participants may send comments or questions throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box, which you can access at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. Today's webinar is recorded and will be made available online later. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Richard to deliver his presentation. Richard, over to you.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, I think everyone can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So I am Richard Baron with the 2050 Pathways Platform here in Paris. Very glad to take part in this important webinar on a topic that we feel very strongly about, and very glad that WRI is organizing this. Next slide, please. So I thought I would start with a bit of a state of play of where long-term strategies for low-emission development objectives are around the world as we know today. So we are working with a number of countries on this map, but I thought I would tell you where things stand officially with the number of strategies that have been submitted to the UNFCCC, and that's a total of 13, with Portugal bringing its 2050 decarbonization roadmap to the table just a few weeks back. So those indicated with a star here have actually tabled their long-term strategies to the UNFCCC as early as late 2016, and more are coming on. What's interesting here is that this map looked nothing like this about a year ago. We have now all the large economies that have started doing work on this and ought to be ready to bring forward long-term strategies looking at their contribution to the Paris Agreement by 2050. Ahead of 2020 or next year. There are, of course, places where less attention is brought to this. We see that a number of African countries have not started this work. I think we see this largely as an issue around both their role in the carbon footprint, but also in terms of capacity. But we're very happy to see countries like Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Africa, of course, but also the Gambia, Morocco, Tunisia, and others that are coming on board. So this is where we are vis-a-vis the geopolitics, if you will, of long-term strategies. The next slide actually shows the typology of strategies as we interpret them from our end. And what I thought I'd do here is just stress very quickly the role of modeling and projections in those particular cases. So we have three broad categories as far as we see them. The first one is those strategies that are largely exploring long-term with model-based scenarios. Jay Edmonds took part in some of those in the US in particular, where basically you look at different sets of technologies and how they might be bringing you to the goal that you've set. you test different technology options, and largely this is about initiating a domestic discussion over what that transition might look like. In the middle group, you have countries where things started the other way around, where a leader, the head of state, says we need to go for carbon neutrality or such goal, and they ask the administration, the research groups, and so on, and the stakeholders to bring together and to backcast a strategy and an emissions pathways that will actually meet that goal. And so there again, the quantification is of great importance. There is often a lot of emphasis that starts on sinks to look at how to go to net zero, and then works back across a range of sectors to see what they need to do over which time frame to actually deliver the intended goal. And the last category is one where the quantification is less important. There's usually not a full emission pathways, but nonetheless some elements that are brought forward on sectoral challenges with some quantification and some estimates of what the future might hold. But these are more strategies that say, we understand the challenge, the IPCC is clear, carbon neutrality ought to be the goal or some such thing. And they look into what are the policy, just transition, technology challenges that they need to resolve to actually get there and take a stand and then bring this forward. Next slide, and that is my last slide. So in the long process that we think is useful to actually deliver a robust, inclusive, and ambitious long-term strategy, I'd like to draw your attention to step 3 and 4, where we think modeling plays a most important role. And that is the time where stakeholders who have specific interests in given sectors or parts of society or issues want to see what the strategy holds for them. And this is not something that can be discussed in a vacuum. This is something that needs to have numbers put forward, quantification, assumptions debated, and so on. Without this, it becomes very difficult to get the buy-in of different sectors and entities who are to play a role in this and need to understand exactly what's going to happen. So, beyond the political decision for long-term strategies, a visioning of where the economy needs to be headed, you need to have that core discussion where the modeling gets worked on and issues are debated among stakeholders based on hard figures that they can reject or agree to. And then the policy and regulatory operations follow from there on. So I hope I've given you a good feel for why we think this is a very important part of the long-term strategy, why modeling needs to be looked at very carefully, and most of all, be designed in a way that answers the specific questions that countries need to see answered in their context. I will leave it at that and give then the floor to Jay as soon as we hear from WRI. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. The next speaker is Jay. Jay, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to Richard, who's offering me the space to participate here. And I'm really happy to have this opportunity to join the webinar. So let's move on to the first slide, which is just to reiterate the long-term goals that, or at least one of the long-term goals that we have, which is very deep decarbonization over rapid periods of time. The holding temperature to 2 degrees Celsius, global mean surface temperature change to 2 degrees Celsius or above pre-industrials, or substantially below that, as low as 1.5 degrees, will be one of the defining challenges of our century. And if we move on to the next slide, in some ways, the challenge is pretty straightforward. You know that emissions of carbon must always eventually get to zero, independent of what the goal ultimately is. And so as we have more ambitious goals, moving from 2 degrees to 1.5, it means that we need to get to zero faster. But the recipe for getting to zero is pretty straightforward. It involves energy efficiency, reducing the demand for energy as much as is economically possible. And this goes on pretty much against the entire time frame of any strategy that is put together. And then decarbonization of the power sector. The power sector has many options. It plays a central role in most decarbonization strategies because you can produce electricity, which is a very convenient form of energy, in a large number of ways that have low or no emissions. You can scrub fossil fuel power plants. CCS provides that opportunity, and there are technology developments in the works that could move the share of capture up to virtually up to 100% in the future. So that's one option, but it's not necessary. You can deploy renewable power, wind and solar. Costs have declined dramatically. They are in many places now the cheapest investment option that you can bring online. And so you see, for example, in the United States, that all of the new plant and equipment there's been no new coal over the last 30 years. All of the new plant and equipment is coming online has been either natural gas or renewables, both lower carbon than average in the sector. Nuclear power remains an option, although in most of the OECD countries, you see relatively little interest in nuclear power today. Bioenergy, which is a renewable energy form, its carbon neutrality stems from the fact that the plant absorbs the carbon from the atmosphere that it returns, and so is a net zero transaction over the life cycle of the plant, although indirect land use emissions remain an important consideration. And in fact, the final point I want to return to is the importance of land use and managing our land use emissions. In many of the scenarios, bioenergy with CO2 capture and storage plays an important role. The combination of bioenergy with CO2 capture and storage provides an opportunity to net remove carbon from the atmosphere. And in strategies, as we'll see in the next slide, that becomes a really powerful tool for getting the economy to zero. Then once you've put the power sector on a path to net zero or negative emissions, then moving electricity into buildings and industry becomes a very effective strategy in combination with energy efficiency, achieving a zero emission. And then finally, the transport sector, which is in a period of uncertain technology future, with many potential options for decarbonization vying for primacy. At the moment, electrification, battery electric vehicles, batteries have improved dramatically. The cost of battery electric vehicles has come down. The infrastructure to support BEVs has moved rapidly into place in OECD countries, but also in China, where it is a major factor in controlling local air quality as well. But biofuels are a potential source of zero emissions and potentially negative emissions when the refineries that take the raw biofuels and transform them into high energy density liquids capture the resulting carbon dioxide that is given off in the process of increasing the hydrogen to carbon ratios. And finally, hydrogen in fuel cells. Well, that is not currently a major focus of most strategies. It's not, I've never given up on any technology because the future is constantly evolving in surprising ways, and things that were impossible at one point suddenly appear to be obviously normal. And I think that the revolution in wind and solar technology costs are a case in point, when I started, people laughed at the idea that you could have 2 cents a kilowatt hour power, and that seems pretty pretty tame in today's world. The final point in all of the strategies is you need to halt deforestation or introduce programs of afforestation, and that's made possible by continuing to improve crop yields. This is a technology frontier that is often overlooked in the development of strategies, but is potentially an important player in the mix. So moving on to the next slide, which I won't spend quite as much time on, but I want to make the point that all sectors of the economy need to participate. You'll see transport, buildings, industry, electricity, agriculture and land use, and non-CO2 greenhouse gases arrayed from left to right in colors that start at red and end in gray. What you see is that over time, the emissions from each one of those sectors in scenarios that achieve 2 degrees or 450 ppm CO2 equivalent in the 21st century all have increasing ambition, and all of them have emissions that are being driven ultimately toward or below zero. You can see that when CO2 capture and storage is available, bioenergy with CO2 capture and storage enables the power sector to offset emissions from non-CO2 greenhouse gases, which are very difficult to control. When CO2 capture and storage isn't available, the suite of models show that the alternative way of providing the offsets comes in agriculture and land use. But some negative emission technology, some way of removing CO2 from the atmosphere is ultimately needed, because some sources of emissions are going to be extremely difficult to control, at least as we understand the technology options today. So moving right along to the models. What's the role of models if we pretty much know what the answer is? And I think the role of models and scenarios, I think they go hand in hand, are really tools for thinking about particular futures. You know the broad outlines of futures that achieve the desired goal, but the particular futures. And the way that I have come to think about the models is that you can try out lots of different things in the models. And if you break the economy, it's no big deal. You just don't do that in the real world. So you can identify good outcomes and avoid bad outcomes. And I think that's perhaps the best thing, or the most important thing, that the use of models and scenarios enable is the avoidance of really bad outcomes that ultimately kill the ability to achieve the goal. Models are similarly a tool for exploring quantitative pathways. If you want to actually make sure that the numbers add up, an extraordinarily important thing to do is to make sure you don't have gaps and you don't double count. And that a good model will ensure that you keep your accounts straight. The other thing that they do is by bringing together all of the pieces of the modeling system in one place, where interactions emerge. They provide insights that you wouldn't get by just looking at one part of the economy at a time. And sometimes these interactions make things easier, sometimes they make them more difficult, but identifying those places where these interaction effects are non-trivial can be an important value for any model in the system. Moving on to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the experience we had in developing the U.S. mid-century strategy, which was released in 2016 in the Marrakesh COP. And there it was a document worked out with the stakeholder. In this case, it was the U.S. government. And the important thing here was the co-development of the knowledge. The model, again, kept the accounts straight, but the model alone didn't give you the answer. If you don't have a buy-in from those who ultimately have to stand up and give the presentation, and a million model results aren't going to do you any good. And now with high performance computing, you can literally produce a million scenarios. But if the people who actually have to do the implementation don't have confidence that this is all going to work and they can see a pathway, they don't see problems that are avoidable, they don't see issues that emerge, then it's not going to work. So in the U.S. development of the U.S. mid-century strategy, you see, I'm not going to walk you through it because they're all of the same elements I just showed you, but the quantitative representation in this scenario of those elements was worked out in a painstaking process that involved not just one scenario. This was the one that was used to create the, to walk people through when you're trying to communicate how deep decarbonization would work. But it was one of ultimately 82 scenarios that were archived. And these 82 scenarios represented, many of which were never published, were efforts on the part of analysts throughout the US government to test what if the technology wasn't as good as you have it in the model? What if the technology was better than you have it in the model? What if things come online sooner? What if they come online later? How does that change the story? How robust is this? And so the ability to do that systematically, reproducibly, and archivably was an important role that the model played. But ultimately, it was the ownership of the US government that was the final product. And they felt that this all made sense. They could explain it to their opposite numbers at the COP, and they could stand behind the strategy that was articulated in the US mid-century strategy. So moving on to the next slide, I'm going to show another example. This is more recent, where I said in the stakeholder in the first example was the US government. Recently, with the C2ES, we undertook a project that engaged other stakeholders. In this case, private sector participants who participated in an exercise thinking through pathways to deep decarbonization. And the pathways to deep decarbonization were varied. They were different than the ones that the US government came up with. And it was really a learning experience for everyone. The three lines, there are actually 6 lines on the figure to the right. And the 3 that have higher emissions are in dashes. And they were the set of assumptions that were worked out with the participants in this study as an initial estimate. And what happened in that initial set of exercises was that as the 3 different scenarios, one led by by top down from the federal government, one where the states provided most of the leadership, and third where the grassroots provided the leadership. The assumptions in all 3 of those were inadequate. And there was this sense that, well, my part of the economy has problems. It's difficult to decarbonize to the degree to 80% relative to 2005 emissions by the year 2050. You know, we're going to do we're going to decarbonize, but we're going to need the other sectors to do more because it must be easier for them than could possibly be for us. What of course comes out of that is that you don't have enough. And the comment I made earlier about all sectors ultimately needing to get very close to zero emissions is a lesson that was one of the takeaways that came out of this exercise. And so while the exercise demonstrated that leadership could come from different parts of the economy, ultimately all parts of the economy needed to participate and needed to achieve deep decarbonization by mid-century, and that while it was difficult, you weren't going to achieve the Paris goals without it. Moving right along to the final slide, I want to make a final point about models. And I don't know if those of you who have read the Lord of the Rings recognize that, but that's the one ring to rule them all. Well, in modeling, there is no one model to rule them all. You actually need multiple models. And in, for example, the US mid-century strategy, while the accounts were kept by the global change assessment model, there were many ancillary models used to conduct analysis on different sectors of the economy, different technologies, different combinations of technologies, all of which were used to create a set of assumptions that everyone was comfortable with. So many models were engaged in the process. And as a recent workshop on what models are needed for supporting the work ahead of us, the conclusion that we reached was that, well, we needed more and better simple models, we needed more and better complex models, more and better sectoral models, more and better regional models. And I think the take-home message is that we're going to need many models to explore the details as well as make sure that everything adds up and is internally consistent, and that the interaction effects are all taken into account. So with that, let me turn the floor back to WRI.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite Marcela to deliver her presentation. Marcela, please.
Hi, Tiro. Thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you to everybody as well that is connected and listening to a very interesting webinar so far. So if we can please move to the next one. So I'm going to be sharing with you our experience here at the IDB on long-term strategies working in Latin America and the Caribbean. And if we move to the next one, we before I share with you what we're doing with supporting countries in the region, I think it's worth stopping and asking first, why are we talking about decarbonization, and what is the role of a long-term strategy in that context? So on to the next one, please. So first, and as Jay already mentioned, we know it's very clear that to meet the Paris Agreement, we need to achieve net zero emissions of CO2 between 2050 and 2070. And please, can we go to the next one? And if we look at, for example, CO2 emissions, where particularly we need to be achieving net zero by around 2050 for the region, this means big transformation in the transport and power and heat sectors, which are the ones that are contributing the most to those emissions and actually also growing the most. So if we move to the next one, please. And now we know as well that reaching net zero emissions is actually technically possible by 2050. And that can be done around those 5 building pillars that Jay already explained in a lot of detail. And we also know that a world with zero net emission is bringing economic opportunities. It's just not necessary costs. And I have some examples here. If you please help me clicking some of them ahead. So we're seeing the cost of renewable energy falling down quite quickly, as well as, next one, please. the cost of battery prices. And next, please. We also see that, for example, this is a picture taken in San Jose, Costa Rica, where the congestions really have direct impact into the quality of life of people that move everywhere in the city. And therefore, transformations such as the one Jay was mentioning on public transport and electrification can really bring direct impact into the everyday life quality of people in San Jose. Next, please. So this makes a lot of sense, and we know this needs to be done, but we also know that governments face what we think 3 main challenges on the road to decarbonize. And the first challenge, in the next one, please, is being able to provide regulation, price signals, and financing that can enable business models for low carbon technologies. And we're already seeing in the region countries going ahead with providing solutions to these challenges. Like, for example, this is a picture from the electric buses in Santiago, where the way the government went about the introduction of this technology, which tends to have higher upfront costs, was making some changes in the regulations to enable the energy utilities to actually be the ones that buy the buses, rather than the usual model where the bus drivers were also the owners. So with this new scheme, the energy utilities buy the buses and they lease them to the bus drivers. And this enables the city to now have quite a growing fleet of electric buses in the city. Another example, if you please click the next one, is still the difficulty to align price signals. So, for example, we see in the region, we still have quite a lot of energy subsidies going to fossil fuels. In some countries, this even represents around 3% of the GDP, and that really make it difficult to make changes to a more efficient and electrification of, for example, transportation. And second challenge that we also see is how to deal with the political economy of these transformations. We know it's going to generate winners and losers, and there are very difficult policies to present. For example, taxes in fossil fuels will not always be seen as positive by the community, but also if we click the next two, there are challenges as well on, for example, how do we manage the tensions with the agriculture and cattle rancher production and the protection of forests, and how do we introduce new policies, for example, to change or restrict public transport in a way that the traditional companies see it positive and don't generate clashes in the cities that can impact everybody. Can you please go to the next one? Then the next challenge is how countries can actually align short-term decisions like designing of NDCs and policies that are effectively aligned with a long-term target. So here, for example, we have a vision of what many of the current NDCs country presented in Latin America and the Caribbean look like. And that's more or less like a reduction of emissions around 20% by 2030. And if we go to the next one, what we realize really is that we're talking, I'm sorry, yeah, this one has a couple of clicks. What we realize, you can go ahead with all of them. Yeah. So one before, please. Thank you, just there. So what we're really looking at here is you can set yourself to build an emission reduction by 2020 that may look like a house, but then you realize that what you really needed to do was to reduce emissions by 100%. And that may look more like building a skyscraper. So if you set yourself to build a house in your first years of work, you may end up in a situation where you realize you should have been building the foundations for enabling that big transformation that was the building. That really just tells us that the objective right now in the short term is build the foundations for the decarbonization and not just achieve a certain level of reduction. So if we go to the next one, please. So in this context, we think that long-term decarbonization strategies can really be helpful to help navigate these three challenges. First, they can help countries establish a clear vision of the carbon-free future they want to go towards and how they bring prosperity to the countries. And in here, we can again point to the example in Costa Rica, where improving public transformation will definitely have impacts into the quality of life of people. And this is the vision that Costa Rica, for example, is pursuing. The next one, The long-term strategies can also help us anticipating costs and manage trade-off that will enable us to have a much just transition. And this, for example, will imply aligning fiscal rules with the changes in decarbonization that we have set for the long term, how we phase out fossil fuels, and what implications that may have in a fiscal revenue for countries that are taxing them. And the next one, please, is finally, they really are the basis to help inform medium and immediate action in countries. So an example here, again from Costa Rica, the country has already decided to make these big transformations in the transport sector, which is a key one for them. And they set a target for 85% electric buses by 2050. However, if you do an analysis on that, you realize that if you want to be on track for that target in 2050, you really need to be having already a 30% electric buses by 2030. And that really now informs you that the following concessions that the country is going to be doing in 2021 will have to be updated. The regulation will have to be changed in order to allow the integration of electric buses in the country. If this is missed right now in 2021, that will make it very difficult for the country to achieve that target in 2030, and even more difficult to get to the 2050 final target. So if we move to the next one, please. So with that context, when we know the importance of long-term strategies to help countries to move into this transition, we have been working in the IDB through NDC Invest to support countries in the region to advance work on long-term strategy, and mainly 3 areas of work. The first one is a focus on strengthening the local capacity to research long-term strategies. The second one is supporting countries in the actual design of their long-term strategies that can inform the new NDCs. And finally, we're also supporting the countries in the implementation of those commitments. So if we move to the next one, we are going to be focusing today mostly on how we are helping and strengthening local capacity to develop long-term strategies. Please, we'll go to the next one. So as Jay already mentioned, and Richard as well, there are many countries that are already working on developing the long-term strategies. This is the case of Mexico, who actually presented a mid-century strategy in 2015. This is the result for the primary energy and the vision that they developed for the transformations that you can see from a fossil fuel-based system to integration of more renewable options. Can we go to the next? And the next one, please. So what we observe, however, is that in the case of our region, and in this particular example, a lot of these academic analyses rely on external international expertise. So for example, for the graph that I just showed you, for the case of Mexico, if we click, please, we realize that many of the models that were used to inform that were international models from US and also from Europe. And that really led us to think that there was a need to strengthen the capacity in our region to be able to use local models that could, please go to the next one, help inform local analysis. And that's why we, in 2018, launched the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Latin America and the Caribbean project, with the objective to improve the capacity of the region to rely on independent domestic evaluations to assess their climate policies and commitments. The project was co-financed by the French Development Agency and the 2050 platform. And we also work with IDRI to tap on their experience on the previous deep decarbonization project and the methods that were used there to really compare and have ways to enable a conversation across the teams. We set 4 main objectives for this project. The first one was obviously very deeply focused on training the academic teams in the countries in Latin America in the use of models and methods to research the long-term strategies that they currently didn't use or didn't have. We also work with them to use those models and those methods to generate emission reduction pathways, so they can really contribute to the public debate that is now taking place in their own countries to define decarbonization pathways. And then we have a very strong focus on how can we enable precisely what Jay was telling us, a very active dialogue and conversation with policymakers in the way that these tools can actually provide value to inform policy decisions. And finally, we also aim to create a regional community of practice where we could have all the different experts coming together, being able to share and compare approaches, results, lessons learned, and have a space to strengthen this dialogue across the region. So please, if we move to the next one. So for this first DDP lab, we work with countries like Argentina, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, and Peru. We work with universities and think tanks in those countries. We pair them with international institutions that will probably suit better the approaches and the research that the local institutions wanted to develop. We have here actually, for example, the very amazing opportunity in the case of Colombia to work with Jay and the team with the University of Los Andes and Rosario. And in each country, the teams decided the sector focus. Most of them include energy and transport, and some of them also include, for example, land. In the case of Mexico and Peru, for example, the focus was on one specific sector. And usually the sectors that were key and more relevant for the country. Each team also worked on developing a model. And here again, maybe to reemphasize some of the previous comments, we didn't marry with any specific model. We really were happy to encourage different approaches. And this can enable us, to precisely see what are the limitations and the advantages to one method or other. And then finally, we had focal points in governments in each of the countries, which were like the entry point to have these very active policy conversations. So these tools and this analysis could really be directly linked to the policy conversations that are now happening in all these countries. Here is very, very important to emphasize that the models that are being built directly in the country teams, they will stay there and they will be free to use free of charge to use and by the local teams. And we think this is definitely a very important value added, and you will see later as well how is that already impacting policy decisions. Can we please move to the next one? So, and the next one. So this is just a summary of how the project looked. We started in 2018, and we are now towards the end of the project. We had already 4 regional meetings, which were really looking at building that regional community of practice. We have all the teams from the local countries and the international organizations, as well as experts and policymakers joining these very interesting conversations where the teams share interim results, approaches, challenges, and at the same time, they were progressing with the modeling and development of scenarios and narratives. And the final results will be published probably early 2020. And we are also putting together a more policy-based focus paper that will capture the main results that the teams identified in the region, and that we are calling the ambition paper. Throughout the 2 years of work, there were a lot of training workshops. The local teams traveled to the international institutions, and the same international institutions visit the local teams. And this is all just to enable that capacity building in the different teams. Can we please move to the next one? And so this is just to say that this capacity building exercise that we're doing through DDP Live is having a direct impact into policy making right now. And it's actually enabled us to deliver in the 2 other areas of support that we do, and that is on the design of long-term strategies and the actual implementation of those. So if we move to the next one, we can share a very good example of this. And this is, for example, the case of Costa Rica, where the government launched the decarbonization plan earlier this year, and they did the design of this plan with direct input and direct work with the University of Costa Rica, which is the university that is part of the DDP Lab project. They make use of those capacities that were created to be able to inform the dialogue and to inform the design of this plan. If you please go to the next one. And just to share, this plan is really an excellent example of what a long-term strategy should look like. And I really encourage everybody to go and read the long version online. So far it's only in Spanish, but it will be soon presented in English, hopefully. But just to give you an overview of what the plan is, the plan sets a target for net zero emissions by 2050. Is now informing the design of a new NDC that is aligned with a long-term target. It frames this transformation as an opportunity to reactivate the national economy, and it does a very good exercise into defining specific actions for the short term. Can we please go to the next one? The plan has 10 main areas of work, touching on all the sectors across the economy. It defines short, medium, and long-term actions. And for those actions in the short term until 2022, it actually specifies very detailed objectives, goals, indicators, and responsibilities to move ahead on those very important actions that will put them on track to achieve the medium and long-term targets. Can we please move to the next one? And the other thing that we're doing now with Costa Rica is we are continuing working with the University of Costa Rica and continue to enable their capacity to research in more detail the long-term strategies. We are doing a robust cost-benefit analysis of what will be the implications of actually implementing the decarbonization plan. We're starting with the transport sector, but we will extend that to all the other areas of work under the plan. And we here have a very strong focus on what Jay was mentioning, and is the importance to involve local stakeholders in this analysis. And we are working as well in using different methods that can help manage better the uncertainties that this kind of analysis will have to deal with. The results of this analysis, some of the results were already presented by the President of Costa Rica in the pre-COP. Some of these results, for example, show that implementing the measures in the transport sector, defining the decarbonization plan, will bring benefits to the country to around 20 billion. And that is not even counting the health benefits and the increased productivity that will bring about another 14 billion by 2050. Can we please go to the next one? And then also, given that the plan is very specific on the policy reforms that the government will need to start carrying out from now on to achieve that long-term target, that is facilitating the IDB to provide financial and technical assistance to enable them to advance on these reforms. Particularly, we are helping them to move ahead with reforms in the electrification of energy uses, on agricultural and nature-based solutions, and governance and MRV. And we are working here with the French Development Agency and with different ministers, particularly Minister of Finance and sectorial ministers and Minister of Energy and Environment, to help them advance on these reforms that will be fundamental to actually implementing those targets. And if we go to the next one, just to say what is next, we're now in conversations as well with the government of Colombia and Ecuador to deliver support to define their long-term strategy, again, working with the teams that were part of the DDP-LAC project. And we are also preparing to continue work under this approach and launch a DDP-LAC 2 in 2020. So that's really an overview of all the work that we're doing. And I will just give back the word to Daryura.
Thank you very much, Marcela. Now, I'd like to give a very, very brief presentation focusing on the use of model-based analysis to explore implications of uncertainties. In developing long-term strategies, we must look through decades ahead. But there are so many uncertain factors that may affect the achievement of the strategy, positively or negatively. Addressing such uncertainties is a major challenge. Model-based analysis can help us identify important uncertainties and develop robust strategies that would perform better in the face of uncertainties. One of such approaches is to construct hundreds and thousands of scenarios reflecting variance in uncertain factors. Then, using models, you can apply all those scenarios to the strategy you have, and you can evaluate the vulnerability of the strategy and find what uncertainties affect the outcome the most. Then you repeat the process with other strategies. Through this process, you can identify robust strategies that perform better across different scenarios and find material uncertainties you might want to address or at least monitor. And also, through this process, you can identify a small set of policy-relevant scenarios. Unfortunately, I don't have much time to explain this approach in detail today. So if you are interested in learning more about this approach, please visit our website and take a look at the publication we recently published. So let's move on to the question and answer session. And I'd like to ask Richard to moderate this session. Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ichiro. And indeed, we have now about 20 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, to take up some of the questions that were raised. Let me start with one that was sent to us on, generally speaking, suppose there would be a long-term strategy for every country. Would there be something like a global accounting system? What about air freight flights, shipping between countries, and deforestation? How would all this be included? So I'd like to see if one of the co-panelists would like to address that question. Any takers? Jay? Yeah.
Well, I believe that countries do have an obligation to report their emissions, and so that's the good news. There are emissions that are very difficult to reduce. That's not to say that there won't be technologies that enable the reduction in emissions in the future. For example, we think of battery electric vehicles penetrating the passenger market, but there are experimental designs for short and mid-range aircraft with batteries. So don't give up on the technology yet. But that's where this negative emissions come in, because those parts of the system that are really difficult to decarbonize, those are the parts that need to be offset by some negative component that allows the system to achieve zero, even if every piece of the system doesn't achieve zero.
Okay. If I may add quickly to that, it is true that most of the strategies do not include air freight and international shipping. However, I think the deforestation, for those who address land use, that part of the accounting, which is the land-based territorial emissions, are accounted for. But yeah, there is a legitimate question to ask about what happens with those international trade-related emissions. And last, I wanted to say as well that you see in some of the long-term strategy documents an account taken of what is the carbon footprint of the country through its imports and its exports. So countries tend to want to look at that part of the picture as well. Anyone else, Ichiro or Marcela, would you like to address the question?
Not on my end.
Not on my side either, Richard. Thank you.
Actually, Marcela, there is a very pragmatic question that is raised on DDP-LAC. It was not, so it says it's not fully clear where the funding came from and what was the order of magnitude for the funding. I can chip in to say that the 2050 Pathways platform offered around $200,000 for the exercise, but maybe you want to pick it up.
Hi, Richard. Yes, sure. Thank you. So yeah, we definitely have the support of the 2050 platform and also the support from the French Development Agency. And this contributed to funds that were channeled from international donors to the IDB. to fund the whole project, which costed around $300,000 per country over the 2 years.
Okay.
So I hope that answered that question.
Okay, then I've got a more general question on the process, which is quite often the process that we describe as being political decision, visioning, modeling stakeholders, and then policy. The person indicates that more often it starts with the vision and the modeling, and then you make a political decision, and then the stakeholders get then engaged, and then the policy gets rolled out. So the question that is raised is, what is the view on the sequence? Anyone want to take that up? Okay, if no one, I can offer maybe a bit of an answer on this one. I think in most countries, we do not start from scratch. The political decision is taken actually on the basis of existing work that has been done either for the NDC or for the Kyoto Protocol or for the Copenhagen meeting. So countries have a large experience for most of them over what the effort implies for the country. But it so happens that in our view, for the long-term strategy to be this inclusive process, it does really help if it's not just a decision that is taken from, say, a Department of Climate Change in a ministry, but actually the head of state says, I want to know where the country is headed with all this. Because then stakeholders feel motivated by the fact that this is a demand coming from the top, that this is going to be taken into account. But of course, the sequence of modeling, of stakeholders' engagement and so on, will be very heavily dependent on the institutional setting that the country has. Sometimes it will be an exercise that starts with the visioning at the government level, mostly. I know Norway is working along those lines now, and that the stakeholder engagement and the sectoral work is going to take place down the line, and it will take actually a number of years to complete. So, but we feel it's important that this high-level political decision be made so that the whole of the economy feels somewhat engaged and is made aware that the transition is a serious policy concern. Any other questions on that?
Richard, maybe just to complement a little bit on that question, something that we have observed in the work on DDP-LAC is that you can also go ahead into starting building the local capacity of academic teams on researching this before you can actually feel a demand from the government on building a long-term strategy. That you have readiness and capacity to really inform the dialogue from the beginning at policy level.
Yeah. Okay, another question goes into more the solution side of decarbonization. A question which I will read out. Electric car and vehicles are good for India, but still there is electricity shortage for basic need and electricity generated from thermal power plant. What if it's not going to pollute more to the environment? I guess the question relates to, we have shortages, we have thermal power plant based on coal, electric cars are good, but what is the overall picture? Jay, maybe you want to take that
Right.
on?
So that's actually a really good point, that the impact of electric vehicles depends on not just the transport sector, but also on the power sector. And if the power sector continues to be if electricity is produced by fossil fuels, then all you've done is you've moved the emissions from the vehicle to the power plant, and you really haven't made any gains at all. So what has to happen concurrently is that the power sector must decarbonize. And so those two things work well in combination, but doing just one or the other doesn't give you a complete solution.
Marcela or Ichiro, any answers you'd like to provide here?
I don't have answer, but I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a approaching to the closing time. So perhaps, Richard, could you pick up one last question to address?
Okay, and just so that people know that I've put questions that we're not going to answer, I just wanted to note that they will be forwarded to us and we'll provide, I think, answers online later on. So maybe I will go with one last, which is, what are the main challenges on the ground for increasing the renewable penetration into the power system? And how well are these challenges represented in the existing model frameworks to inform us about the solution pathways? And someone is suggesting maybe the example of the US, but I'm sure Marcela can also take that on. So maybe Jay?
Right. So the renewable energy, the costs of new power from wind and solar have come down dramatically. In many instances, it is the cheapest way to provide electricity at the margin. The big challenge is gas. Gas prices are also low. And while gas is only half of the emission of coal, it's still a fossil fuel. And ultimately, a strategy for deep decarbonization can only rely on gas as a temporary part of a solution set. Ultimately, a non-emitting power sector is essential, and ultimately a negative emitting power sector is desirable. So the strategy really needs to be one of overcoming these challenges to, one, getting the existing, and in the US it's not as big a deal as in, say, China or India. The coal plants tend to be old. They tend to be leaving the system rapidly. Last year we offloaded more coal-fired power plants than in any year in history. And so it's really the rate of removal of those from the system and their replacement with the lower cost renewable options. In other parts of the world where the coal infrastructure is new, that's a very much tougher problem, and one where the solution isn't yet obvious.
Marcela, do you want to add to that?
Yes, Richard, just to contribute to that, we see particularly in the Latin America and the Caribbean region, there is not really a problem now linked to the technology, not even to the prices. In many countries, the actual cost of renewable energy is falling down quite quickly and is quite cheap. But what we do see is a challenge into being able to change and move as fast as possible with the changes in regulation. In many cases, the current regulations are not favor or facilitate integration of new renewable energy technologies, and just follow very traditional systems, particularly around centralized power generation. So that's where most of the work, I think, will be needed, and where the challenge is now to be able to unlock more integration of renewable energy.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcela. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it at that for the Q&A, but we have taken good notes of the interesting ones that I see coming up now. So we'll do our best to answer them and provide the answers to those who have connected. So shall I then give the floor back to WRI?
Yes, thank you, Richard, and all the panelists. And as Richard mentioned, we will follow up the remaining questions offline later. And I'd like to thank all the panelists and participants for joining us today. And we have more webinars to come, and I encourage you to visit our website to find out more. Next webinar will be about crafting a vision for long-term strategies, including setting the long-term mitigation, adaptation, and development targets. We will make more information available on our website later. You can also view the recording of past webinars at the website. And with that, I'd like to close the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.